Democracy, a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. Now, the recent general election has kicked up once again the question of whether or not we live in a democracy in the UK and under Westminster, and realistically the answer is no, not even nearly. So let's have a look at how our democracy is run. At the very top we have the Queen, or the monarchy. Now, she's the head of state of the UK, meaning that the government operates on her behalf, but more importantly, on her consent. You may have seen the Queen on TV recently during the opening of the new Parliament. Traditionally, the reigning monarch will deliver a speech outlining the new government's plans for the next 5 years. And so, beneath her crown featuring over 2,800 diamonds and atop a golden throne, it was patiently explained to us all that austerity was a necessity and further cuts to public services were coming, as we were reminded that we are all in this together. Shortly afterwards, her crown was taken back to its own personal horse-drawn carriage and departed. By the end of May, the Queen further demonstrated how we were all in this together, as taxpayer funding from the monarchy rose by a third to £40 million, while the Conservative government also announced further cuts to welfare, which, according to the Children's Society, could result in over 70,000 children in the UK living on £2 a day. Democracy, a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. Is the Queen elected into this position of privilege? Does she represent the whole population? No. She maintains her position based purely on her bloodline, and that's strike one. Now, many are going to argue that the Queen doesn't have any real power anymore, so that doesn't count. Well, that's both right and wrong. The Queen does still have the power to sign international treaties and to deploy armies abroad, but really the powers that the monarchy used to hold have just been transferred to someone else, the Prime Minister. And because of the nature of that power, it means that the Prime Minister can make decisions that do not require the approval of Parliament, just like a monarch could. He also gets to pick and choose who his ministers are, who oversee their departments. It means that any lunatic can be given a position if the Prime Minister decides, such as Michael Gove, the new Justice Secretary, who wanted to reintroduce hanging and was against a public inquiry into the Westminster paedophile rings. Priti Patel, the Employment Minister, who authored Britannia Unchained, which claimed that British workers were the worst idlers in the world. Brandon Lewis, the Minister for Housing, who also happens to be a landlord and has a vested interest in keeping the sector without regulation. Or Nicky Morgan, the Equalities Minister, who voted against equal marriage. Although, to be fair, she has since said, given the chance to vote again, she would probably vote in favour this time. Democracy, a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. Did we elect these people to their respective offices? No. And does the Prime Minister need to act in accordance with those that we do elect? No. Strike two. But let's move past the Prime Minister and down to the two legislative chambers where law and policy is made, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So the House of Lords has 787 members, not one of which was elected by the people. 26 have seats because they happen to be the correct religion and come from the Church of England. 92 of them are there because they inherited the seat from their father, with very few women, by the way, since most hereditary peerages can only be inherited by men. A lot of the peers have come from political parties, but there are at least 27 who did not come from being an MP, but did make significant cash donations to political parties prior to being nominated to take a seat in the House of Lords. Like back in 2006, when Tony Blair nominated several men for life peerages who had loaned large amounts of money to the Labour Party. Now, these 787 members of the House of Lords are currently given £300 a day for their hard work, whilst also costing the taxpayer about £60,000 a week in food subsidies. Now, thankfully, we are all in this together, and recently the Lords were faced with the proposition of having to share catering budgets with others. But so worried were they that they would have to drink champagne of a lesser quality as a result that they fought against it and won. So maybe we're not in this together after all. Democracy, a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. The House of Lords are not elected by the people, strike three. And finally, the House of Commons. Now, this is where our elected representatives actually end up, although they are outnumbered by the unelected Lords by 137. 650 seats are given to those that we democratically elect. Or so you think, because we have a system in the UK for voting called first past the post. This basically means that whoever happens to get the most votes overall wins a seat, and anyone who voted for a different representative essentially wasted their vote. Now, this might seem like the logical way to vote until you start to look a little bit deeper. At the general election, the Conservative Party only received 36.9% of votes across the whole of the UK. 36.9%, and yet they are now the majority government. To put this into context, the Green Party and UKIP collectively took over 16% of the vote across the UK. That's about half of what the Conservatives got, yet only got 2 seats compared to the Conservatives' 331. A petition with over 500,000 signatures on it calling for electoral reform has been submitted to the government, with the backing of Plaid Cymru, the Greens, the Lib Dems, UKIP and the SNP, despite the fact that the SNP have overwhelmingly benefited from this system, getting 95% of the seats in Scotland with support of only 50% of the electorate. In fact, the only major parties who are not supporting electoral reform are the Conservative Party and Labour, who have both historically benefited from the skewed system. Democracy, a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. The key words here are whole population. The first past the post system makes it impossible for the whole population to be represented, and it encourages voting not for the party that you want to win, but for the party instead that could win and who you dislike the least. That's 4 strikes against democracy, because the UK is not a democratic country. We have a situation right now where the Scotland office, the office that represents Scotland in Westminster and Westminster in Scotland, is being run by David Mundell, Scotland's only Conservative MP, as chosen by David Cameron, despite the Conservatives getting less than 15% of the vote in Scotland. And from there, Mundell has a veto over legislation passed in Holyrood from powers that have actually been devolved. So some of the powers that we're supposed to be getting can only be used if Westminster allow it. Sources from the Scotland office have been quick to say that there is no veto, but a quick look through the Scotland Bill shows over and over again that Scottish ministers cannot pass legislation without consulting and being given the go-ahead by the Secretary of State, David Mundell. If we want better politics, we need a better political system, and we're building it. Residents in Shetland and Orkney started a crowdfunding campaign to call it a by-election after it was revealed that Alistair Carmichael, the Lib Dem MP for that constituency, had leaked a memo with the intent of smearing Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon while he was Secretary of State for Scotland. So yeah, the guy who was meant to be representing Scotland in Westminster was instead leaking smear stories against the First Minister that he later admitted in a letter to Sturgeon were incorrect. And after the story was released, he apologised and then chose his own punishment himself. As he managed to keep his seat by only about 800 votes, a by-election seems like the right thing to do, as he leaked this story in the run-up to the election, but he is refusing to call one. He has since hired a lawyer to fight those crowdfunding against him. But for me, the hero of this story is still Twitter user A. Carmichael, who, despite not being Alistair Carmichael, did take the brunt of the abuse directed towards him when the whole news story about the leak kind of came out. She did seem to take it in good humour. What is incredible is that when faced with a political system that seems to let lying and smearing slide, it is the people of Scotland who have so far raised over £55,000 to legally challenge it. And with Malcolm Bruce, former Scottish Lib Dem leader, openly saying that Parliament is full of liars and we should just kind of accept that as it happens, it's great to see a campaign that says that that just isn't good enough anymore. And speaking of former leaders of the Liberal Democrats, I do want to wrap up this episode of Left Scotland with a very short tribute to Charles Kennedy, who passed away this week at the age of 55. While we certainly did not agree on some issues, Kennedy was undoubtedly a warm and principled man who battled his demons for many years. I was very sorry to hear the news of his passing. But for now, that's everything from Left Scotland. I'll be back next week with your weekly news roundup. The crowdfunding campaign I launched while not hitting its target does guarantee content for the next 6 months, so thank you all so much. Your regularly scheduled content is coming soon. Please do like, share and subscribe. Links to everything interesting can be found below, and I'll see you all next week.